now that we've been sufficiently fortified with a wonderful dessert, and whoever made it, thank you so much. I very much enjoyed the fruit, and I was quite healthy and stayed away from the sweets. The spirit of my wife hovers over us. And it was delicious, so thank you for whoever made those desserts. What I'd like to do in this second portion is to go a little bit deeper on some of the key issues that I raised in the first half of this evening around this idea of deconstruction and people walking away from faith. And I've ended up with 6 reflections. I wish there was one thing that I could say. I wish I could stand here and say, the one thing that we need to understand about deconstruction is this, or the one perspective that we need on it is this. But the more that I've looked at it, the more that I realized just what a complex thing it is and just how many different things are going on. I managed to get it down to 6 in the end. You'll be relieved that it's not the, 15 or something that I started with. But I can't reduce it anymore without dumbing it down too much and not doing justice to the people who are going through this and the complexity of their experiences. So I apologize, it's 6 sort of random thoughts, but I do think we need them all to try and get a grip on this thing called deconstruction. So the first one is that everyone has been catechized. The idea of catechism just being teaching someone a way of being and a way of viewing the world. You know, the churches have these catechisms where it's a series of questions and answers that sort of teach you the Christian faith in question and answer form. That's a catechesis. But society catechizes us very effectively and relentlessly as well, not with questions and answers, of course, but in 1,000 different ways each day. We are catechized into a particular way of viewing the world and being in the world through, for example, obvious example, our smartphones, and the way that we relate to all the information out there in the world in relation to our smartphones. So just one small but significant example. Has it ever struck you as curious that all the voice assistants on smartphones are female voices? That's not random. There are reasons to that, and that inculcates into us a particular way of being in the world and relating to gender differences and so forth. And if you think about the way that our cities are set out, the shopping mall teaches us a particular way of being in the world and teaches us certain expectations and what's available to us, what's not available to us. The layout even of this room teaches us to expect certain things out of it. Here I am standing up, I'm the only one standing up, raised up a little bit, everyone's sitting down in rows facing me. That teaches us to expect certain things from this encounter. Now, nobody sort of stood up and said, now please would you recognize that all the chairs are in rows here and the person at the front is going to... Nobody said that, but we just naturally walk into that situation. It's not explicit, it's just part of the way that life is set up, and it teaches us to expect certain things out of certain situations. So this is what I mean when I say that the world around us is catechizing us in all these subtle ways, thousands of them every day, from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep. And it is very effective in catechizing us into a certain way of living in the world, to having certain dreams and certain fears, certain expectations of life. What am I entitled to? What should I be able to expect from others? All that sort of stuff. Nobody ever sits you down and goes through it in a list, but it's clear to all of us because our society has been so effective in catechizing us. Now, of course, the church tries to catechize people who go along to it as well. There'll be a sermon on Sunday mornings. There'll be meetings like this where we're discussing issues from a Christian point of view. There might be midweek Bible studies and so forth. And so the church is also trying to teach people a particular way of understanding the world and being in the world and what to expect and who we are and all that sort of stuff as well. But there are 3, I think, key differences between the way that late modern society catechizes us and the way that our churches catechize us. And the first difference is that when the church does it, it's usually very explicit. You know, here I am, for example, standing up here, teaching, essentially, certain things from a Christian point of view. Like, no one would mistake this for a sort of neutral situation. You know, I'm trying to teach stuff as best as I'm able, and you guys are free to accept it or not, but everybody's clear that is what is going on here. It's explicit. Same thing on a Sunday morning. You expect to receive instruction of some sort. But the way that late modern society does it isn't as explicit as that. You know, your smartphone doesn't sort of flash up in the morning, I am now going to tell you how to be in the world. It just does it. You know, the shopping mall down the road, or the way that a lecture theatre at a university is set out doesn't shout out at you, you are being taught at the moment what a human being is, but nevertheless you are. And so the catechesis that we get from society is very often implicit, it's unspoken, whereas the sort of catechesis we get from church is usually explicit, you usually know when it's happening. The second difference is that the catechesis we get from a church is punctual. It's happening at particular points during the week. It's happening right now, for example. It's happening on Sunday morning. It's happening in a Bible study group. It's happening in the personal Bible study that we may do. But the catechesis that we get from society is, you know, relentless and unremitting and constant. And from the moment we wake to the moment we sleep, we're being taught how to be a human being in late modern society in thousands of different ways. So it's never off. And therefore there's a danger, especially for Christians, I think, that it feels like society is so to speak, on video, but Christianity is only on audio, because we're always being catechized to be late moderns, but we're only, for some bits of the week, being catechized to see things from a biblical point of view. So you can see why people would feel sort of an overwhelming urge to conform to a late modern culture, whereas the sort of itch to live a biblically shaped life might be less immediate, because the input that we're getting from the Bible is much less than the input that we're getting. You know, if you count up, for example, you know, how many hours a week do I spend reading and meditating on the Bible, and then put that on one side, and how many hours a week do I spend consuming media that's not explicitly Christian, and put that on the other side, and then how much time in a week do I spend interacting with people who are explicitly Christian, and then how much, you know, if you do that, I would be astonished if it's anything other than an overwhelming weight of time invested in being catechized into late modernity, as opposed to being catechized into a Christian view of the world. So that's the second difference. The third difference between the two ways of being catechized is that culture doesn't stay the same, it changes. Late modernity in the year 2023 is not the same as what my parents believed, when they were young, or what their parents believed, what my grandparents believed. Culture changes quite radically, actually, over time. You know, if you parachuted us down into, Melbourne or Geelong 1800, it's a foreign country. It's very, very alienating for us, I would suspect. Whereas the Bible, the claim at least, is that this view of the world is constant. Now, it's got different cultural expressions, of course, but the Bible itself doesn't change over time. And so that's another difference, that culture is constantly evolving, really quite radically, within even one generation. And so the culture that we are now being catechized into is not our parents' culture. It is really quite fundamentally different. Whereas the culture that the Bible is seeking to, or the way of viewing the world that the Bible is seeking to commend, is in its core ideas unchanging over 2,000 years. That's a long time. Culture has changed a lot in 2,000 years. So these two ways that we're being catechized are fundamentally different in these three significant ways. And that raises a whole lot of questions, I think, in relation to deconstruction. And I'll just touch on one of them, and it's this. If we are being so effectively catechized by late modern society, as I think it's inevitable to concede that we are, then is our understanding of the faith keeping pace with that rich and deep catechesis that we're receiving from the society around us? Because if we are growing in wisdom and understanding of what it means to be a late modern person, as I think we all are as we go through life, inevitably, at a certain pace, but our understanding of the Christian faith isn't growing alongside it, then eventually we're going to become like one of those people who always goes to the gym to work out their arms, but never does their legs. We're going to have these huge, hulking cultural biceps and these spindly little matchstick theological legs. And our faith is going to start seeming babyish to us, because it is a babyish faith compared to the sophistication of our understanding of culture. And therefore, I think that one challenge that I want to throw out to Christians this evening is the sophistication of your understanding of the Bible keeping pace with your sophistication of your understanding of your area of expertise in life and of culture? Now, in my particular case, as a university lecturer, that's quite a sort of a specific advanced knowledge of a particular area. And so the challenge for me is, do I know the Bible in a way that's comparable to the way that I know philosophy? So that's how it sort of cashes itself out in my life. But for everyone here, it's going to be different. Because if you keep progressing and deepening your understanding of culture, but your understanding of the Bible is basically Sunday school throughout the whole of your life, it's not hard to see where that's going to lead. And that's just going to seem babyish and unsatisfying at a certain point, because you've grown so much in this area but not in that. So it's just something to reflect on for all of us, whether we're deconstructing or not, or have no interest in deconstruction, just as a general principle. I think we have a responsibility for our understanding of the faith to keep pace with our understanding of other things. I'd love to talk about that afterwards if people want things to read. Very happy to throw out some possible books and things to do about that. But I think as a general principle, it's something for us to be aware of, and we shouldn't be surprised if we don't do that, if eventually our faith seems very babyish to us compared to our understanding of the rest of life. So that's the first reflection. Everyone has been catechized. The second is that the Bible shouldn't fit snugly in our culture. One thing that I noticed time and again listening to the podcast and watching the YouTube channels about people who are talking about their deconstruction is that they had, very understandably, very 21st century Western objections to Christianity. That it was sort of telling them what to do, not regarding their freedom, that there were issues with gender, there were issues with sexuality and so forth. And essentially they were expressing a disquiet and a frustration that the Bible didn't fit snugly in 20th century culture. 21st century culture. There are some ways in which the Bible rubbed up against that culture. And I just want to think about that together with you for a moment. And I want to suggest, hopefully not too controversially, that it is actually a really healthy thing that the Bible doesn't completely fit snugly into 21st century Australian culture, for example. Because if it did, if there was nothing in the Bible that was in any way objectionable to a 21st century young Australian, then there would necessarily be much in the Bible that was objectionable to every other culture. Because different cultures think very differently about the world, both historically and geographically. And at that point, the Bible would have a cultural home. It would be a Western book. It would be a 21st century book. It would have a cultural center of gravity that would mean that this culture in which we're now living is more biblical than all the other cultures. And one reason that is a very uncomfortable position to be in is that leads to all sorts of cultural imperialism and colonialism. If you think our culture fits the Bible, this is the culture that the Bible has nothing to complain at, that fits snugly, well, then necessarily everyone who disagrees with me, with this culture, is going to be further away from God, further away from the Bible. And so I think one of the brilliant things about the Bible is that there is no culture, either geographically or historically, that can just read it from cover to cover and say, I told you so. Yes, that is what I thought before. Nothing to scandalize me in here at all. And it is also a really precious truth that the Bible has no natural cultural home. There's no particular human culture that can lay a claim to the Bible and say, this is us, this is reflecting us. Not least because that the Bible is written across so many different cultures itself. It's not written in one go. It's written to communities who are by turns nomadic and self-governing and exiled and then under occupation. It's written in different languages, for goodness sake. You know, what other major religious text is written in 2 major languages and then a little bit of a third one as well, over centuries? This is a multicultural book. And if it is multicultural, it means it doesn't fit completely in any single culture. And I want to suggest to you tonight that that is a feature of the Bible, not a bug. And we shouldn't try to make it completely at home in our culture, because what we sacrifice if we do that is its ability to speak to all other cultures. And we appropriate it, essentially, as a late modern Western artifact, which it most certainly isn't. The Bible is many things, but it is not a Western book. It's written by Middle Eastern Jews in the New Testament, and then wandering sort of Hebrew communities and so forth in the Old Testament. It's not a Western book. And woe to us if we seek to make it such. Or indeed, if we suggest that the fact that it isn't is God's problem. I think that says something very eloquent and very deep about us, I think, as well as suggesting something perhaps about God. Number 3, be clear what you're condemning if you're deconstructing, or what you're commending if you're a Christian. So this really is a message for both sides of this debate, for the people who are deconstructing and then for Christians as well, because I think in both cases, I've noticed a tendency to sort of wrap up the gospel message, the core biblical message about Jesus dying for our sins and so forth, with a particular subculture. So that it becomes a package deal. You've got to, in order to accept what the Bible is teaching, you've got to become part of our culture as well. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. And then in the reverse, in order to distance yourself from this particular culture, you've got to walk away from what the Bible is teaching. They're sort of glued together. And I think this comes out in when I had the table up behind me in the first half of this talk, this narrowness language. People who are deconstructing feel constricted, and if there's a line on everything. There's the way that you dress, and there's a way that you speak, and there's a way that you are as a Christian, and that's so narrow and constricting. And it is, isn't it? If that were the essence of Christianity, I think that would be terribly narrow and constricting. I always remember when I was an undergraduate, the church that I went to at university, most people sort of looked pretty much like each other. But there was this one guy, this is going to sound quite strange, slightly embarrassing. There was this one guy who dyed his hair. My goodness, it's like the world's going to end. He dyed his hair. And I remember my youth leader at the time saying, "I'm so glad that he did that." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And he said, because it's showing you that you don't have to part your hair at the side and brush it across your head to be a Christian. You know, he was saying it is so good for us that there is someone in the church who looks different to the other people, because it's making that deep theological point that you're not a Christian because you don't dye your hair. Like, dye your hair, don't dye your hair, whatever. Believe in Jesus. And that's always stuck with me ever since. And that welcoming of, people dressing differently, doing their hair differently, looking differently, talking differently, standing differently, is just so healthy for a church, because it reminds us as Christians, and it gives other people who are coming in from the outside again the message that being Christian is not about being a member of a particular subculture. That's not what we're preaching here. That's not what we want. Like, don't dress like the people at the front. We don't want that. Dress however you dress, and trust Jesus Christ for your salvation. And I think that the ability, and it's really hard because we're all so steeped in our subcultures and we don't realize often what is part of our subculture, but being able to try and tease those apart and say, this is our message over here, and this is our subculture. We know it's a bit weird, we're working on it, sorry about that, but you don't have to buy into all this stuff to be a fully card-carrying member of the church. You just need to believe the gospel, is really important from a church's point of view. And also it's what we should expect as Christians. We shouldn't expect our subculture to be better than anyone else's. And I think there are deep theological reasons for that. Partly it's because, as Jesus himself says, there is no one good but God alone. So the standard of good doesn't come from within any human culture. The standard of good comes from God, and he's outside all human cultures. He's the creator. He's not part of the creation. And similarly, no one is utterly and exhaustively evil apart from the devil. No human culture is the embodiment of evil. And so we're going to expect in any human culture, are we not, if that's true, a mixture of things. There's going to be some aspects of it that are probably quite helpful, probably quite nourishing, lead to human flourishing. And there's going to be some aspects of every single human culture, including every single church culture, that are really unhelpful. It's just that they're a blind spot for that particular culture, so they're not addressing it because they don't see it. And I don't see my blind spots either. So it's all going to be a mixture. So that's what we should expect. We shouldn't expect our particular Christian subculture to be universally healthy. We should treat it with a certain amount of suspicion if we read our Bibles carefully. So that's the word to Christians. Be clear on what you're commending, that it is the gospel, not a particular subculture. And don't make people sign up to a particular subculture in order to be Christians. And then the message to those deconstructing is be careful what you're condemning. Because listening to a lot of the podcasts and the really painful testimonies that people gave were ways that they'd been messed around by particular Christian subcultures and really treated in profoundly damaging ways as a result of particular Christian subcultures. And as a result of that, they were walking away from Jesus. And it was almost as if they were pointing the finger at the Phariseeism of the church and then walking away from the Jesus who condemned Pharisees. Like, that stuff that you are looking at in that church is not good, but that's not Jesus. He is not glued to that subculture in a way that you can't see the difference between them. And so I guess my plea to people who are deconstructing would be to try and tease out those differences. Are you fundamentally either angry or disillusioned or hurt by whatever your particular story is, a particular Christian subculture, or by God himself? Are you outraged at something about God or something about a subculture? And those two things are very different things to be outraged at or sad at or hurt by. And they both need working through, but you would do that in very different ways for those two things. And it's worth just trying to work on your own experience and feelings. Which of those is really the issue here? Is it a particularly obnoxious Christian subculture, or do I have issues with God? And there's probably some sort of mixture there, but one of those will tend to predominate. And I think it's also really helpful for us, both as Christians and as people who might be deconstructing, to realize that it's not an all or nothing choice. Because sometimes the way that it's presented in these podcasts is you had to sign up to everything about this Christian subculture and think that it's completely okay in everything that it says and does and the way that it behaves, or your only other option is to walk away from the faith. And again, you only need to sort of use those words to raise the issue. Well, surely it's not as simple as that. That seems a very crude set of choices. Surely there's something more subtle than that. But I think part of it, and this is me going out on a limb, and I don't know if this is right or not, I wonder if we're losing or have lost or perhaps ever even had the ability to disagree healthily and to critique healthily in our culture. I'm sort of thinking of Twitter, and I know that society is not summed up by what happens on Twitter, but it is nevertheless an indication of how people think. And it seems that everything is pushed to the two extremes, that you either completely love something or it's the worst thing ever and you want it cancelled or whatever, or you just want to walk away from it. And we've lost the flexibility and the suppleness and the language to inhabit a space where we're unhappy with something, but the solution to that is not just to walk away from the whole thing. And let me just offer a couple of thoughts about this. There's much, much more to say, but I'm aware of time and I've got other points to get through. I think we've lost the language and the posture of biblical lament. If you read through the Bible, there's a very important theme of lamenting, and it's something that's learned. When Israel was in exile or when they'd sinned grievously against God, There's a way of being and a language to use that expresses sorrow and grief and hurt, but that's not, oh, I'm going to just jack the whole thing in. I'm just going to walk away from the whole thing. And I don't see a lot of that vocabulary or that posture of lament in our society. So that may be something that we can recover from the Christian tradition. And I wonder if another thing that we're not very good at, I count myself in this as well, is loving confrontation. I think, let me just speak from my own experience, and if this resonates with you, then fantastic. I tend to stew away at things privately until they get to such a point where it's like breaking point, and then you just walk away. So if I've got a problem with church, I'll let it stew and it'll build up over the weeks and I'll get more and more resentful. And then, eventually you can see that leading to a point where I've had it, I'm out of here. Whereas what I find hard, and I'm guessing a lot of people in today's society find hard, is the idea of critiquing or confronting in a way that's out of love, not out of opposition or confrontation. And that's happened to me a couple of times, I think, in my life. And each time it's really struck me, oh my goodness, this person isn't telling me I'm wrong because they want to show that they're better than me or because they want to do me down. They're actually trying to help me. And it's just a wonderful thing when it's done in that spirit. And I wonder if it's, and I'm not suggesting this is either the fault of the people who find problems with church or simply the fault of the people who run churches. It's probably a little bit of both. I think we all take criticism personally, don't we? And if, people say, people can go on for 10 minutes about how well you've done. There's one thing they said that you didn't do well. That's the thing you remember. Or is that only me? I'm sure it's not only me. I wonder if we've lost the ability to take criticism as well as we've lost the ability to give it. But perhaps if there was more of that done in a spirit of love and collaboration that went on, it wouldn't be that you'd feel that you have to stew away in silence and then get to breaking point and walk away. There'd be a lot of steps in between that, perhaps. Number 4, the church should be self-critical. It is really quite extraordinary that throughout the Bible, there is a sustained and really quite deep critique of all the Bible's own heroes. There's no one in the Old Testament that gets away from this. Like Abraham sells his sister down the river and tries to sort of sacrifice her to save himself. And Moses is proud when he strikes the rock twice. David is an adulterer and then tries to get the woman that he committed adultery with, tries to get her husband killed to cover it up. And like that's not normal in a religious text. Now, normally the heroes are heroes, or in even secular texts, you read like the ancient Greek stuff, like Achilles is a hero, Odysseus is a hero. You're not going on and on and on and on and on about his faults. There's something unusual in the Bible about this. There's only one character in the whole Bible who doesn't get this done to him, that's Jesus. Like Peter is a fool. James and John, the sons of thunder, just walk into situations that they should know better about. And there's this reflex of critique built into the Bible. You just read the prophets. They're always pointing the finger at Israel's priests and kings and people as well. That no one gets off scot-free. And there's a sense in which the Bible of all religious books and Christianity of all belief systems, secular or religious, is hardwired to be self-critical. It's built into it. There is no Christianity without the prophets and without Jesus pointing his finger at the Pharisees. Think of the Reformation, for example. That church history is punctuated by people critiquing, from within the church, critiquing the church. Luther didn't want to leave the church to begin with. He just wanted to reform it. And there's this lovely motto from the Reformation, in Latin, semper reformanda, always reforming. And the assumption there is that we're always going to be stuffing up. And we're always going to need to be being dragged back to the Bible because we, in ourselves, are not going to get things right. And therefore, Christianity opens itself up structurally to self-critique in quite an unusual way, I think. And so it shouldn't be either surprising or threatening when the church or a particular ministry is critiqued. I think if we've read our Bibles well, we should be welcoming and expecting that. Because that's what always happens when sinful people are put in charge of things. We partly stuff them up. That is what we do. That's our modus operandi. That's our calling card. We do not do things perfectly. And so the whole Bible is opening us up as a church, I think, to welcome critique in a way that is not universal in all belief systems, I think. And this is not just something that's happened in the history of the church. It's something that I think is a sign of a healthy church today. So, Harry, if we could have the next slide. Just give you two quick examples. This is Karen Swallow Pryor, who later on this year is bringing out a book called The Christian Imagination. I just wanted to read you a quick quote from the book that I've got here. She says, the religious beliefs and cultural currents that birthed the evangelical movement in the 18th century and manifested as political and social values in the centuries that followed exist now as unexamined assumptions swirling within the evangelical imagination. A central goal of this book is to help tease out these elements of the evangelical social imaginary in such a way that those elements that are truly Christian can be better distinguished from those that are merely cultural. So here's someone today critiquing the church, saying these bits of what we do and how we think are bad and dangerous, and we should get rid of them, and they're not the gospel. And the second example that I've got here is a guy called Willie James Jennings, who wrote a very similar titled book a few years ago called The Christian Imagination. And he pulls no punches. Let me read you a quick quote from him as well. I argue here that Christianity in the Western world lives and moves within a diseased social imagination. Christian theology now operates inside this diseased social imagination without the ability to discern how its intellectual and pedagogical performances reflect and fuel the problem, further crippling the communities it serves. Now, it's an academic book, and that was an academic quote, but basically he's saying we have stuffed things up royally. The way that we, as an evangelical, as a Christian community, think about the world is profoundly wrong and dangerous and has led to all sorts of issues, and we need again to be able to distinguish that from the gospel message so that we can see the damage that we've caused in the way that we've thought about the world and repent of that and move away from it. And the reason that I wanted to give these two quotations is just to show that from within the church, so Jennings is an ordained minister and Karen Swallow Pryor teaches at a theological seminary. These are not people swiping at the church from the outside. Within the church, both historically and today, there is a strong and vigorous and rich tradition of critique. It is normal and good and healthy for the church to be subject, for Christian culture to be subject to this sort of critique. And so the idea that you've either got to completely buy the whole Christian subculture and be okay with everything, or walk away from the church, I think cuts against the grain of the whole Old and New Testament, where the religious institutions of the day are constantly being critiqued by the prophets and Jesus and others. But it also flies in the face of contemporary Christian culture, where there are voices like Karen Swallow Pryor and Willie James Jennings launching really quite profound critiques of Christianity from within Christianity. And so this idea that you've got to agree with everything or walk away, I just think is too simple, too much of a reduction, and a lack of an understanding of the way that Christianity works, in a sense that there is this critique built into it. So the church should be self-critical. Number 5, don't expect a God's eye view. This is something that struck me. So I listened to a bunch of podcasts and YouTube videos of people who are deconstructing. I also listened to some Christian talks about deconstruction to try and see how people addressed this thing. And on both sides, something struck me that is quite sort of unsettling and a little bit unnerving. And it's an assumption that we as human beings are fundamentally transparent to ourselves, that we can understand ourselves fully. And on the Christian side, this comes across when people will say things like, oh, the reason people are deconstructing today is that they want to sleep with their girlfriends and boyfriends. And it's like, oh, okay, well, that's really easy then. I didn't know it was that simple. And it's as if there's this one thing that will unlock this really complex phenomenon, and what it's really about is people want is, really? Is that simple? It doesn't seem that simple when you listen to what these people are saying. And then on the other side, there's this rhetoric of, I had the wool pull over my eyes for many years, but now I finally see everything clearly and I finally see who I am. And again, you want to ask the same sort of question. Really? Is it that simple? Is it that sort of the switch was off and now it's on? Is that how we work as people? Is that the transparency we have to ourselves? And I think on both sides, there's this instinct that I understand fully. I know what's going on here. Let me explain it to you in one or two sentences. And as I reflected on that, I think, where's that coming from? Like, why are people reacting in that way? And I think part of it comes down to something, again, that this philosopher Charles Taylor, who I quoted earlier, talks about. And he traces the fall of Christianity, I guess, the world becoming secular from about 1500 up until the 20th century. And one thing that he notices in that journey is that there's a moment when people started expecting God to be completely understandable, God's ways to be completely transparent to us. Around the 17th century, around sort of Descartes' time, there was an assumption that I should be able to understand everything about God. And if I can't, if I don't agree with it, then it must be God's fault, not mine, because he should have made himself clearer. Now, that's not what most people have thought, either culturally, geographically, or historically. But it enters into the culture as an expectation for various philosophical reasons. But it's what most of us think, I think, today, that I should be fundamentally understandable to myself. I should be able to understand myself. And God should be fundamentally understandable to me. And if he isn't, if there's any mystery, then it's God's fault, because he hasn't communicated himself well enough. And so there's this expectation of transparency. And I think that becomes part of the language of deconstruction on both sides, that Christians think that they know what's going on with deconstruction because people should be transparent, and the deconstructors think that they know what's going on utterly inside themselves because, again, people should be transparent. And I think it's worth just raising that as a point, because it's one of those ways we've been catechized culturally that just goes under the radar. It's like, well, obviously I understand myself. Like, what are you talking about? But I think it's helpful to be able to make that visible so that we can then interrogate that. And there's a whole other evening we could do on self-identity and so forth that will go further into that, but I don't want to take more of your time with that tonight. But I just raise it as it is part of our culture to expect God to explain himself fully to us, and if he doesn't, it's his fault. Finally, we're not brains on sticks, obviously. And what I'm trying to get over with this is just the complexity, the different dimensions that are involved when people deconstruct their faith. That it's never in my experience, perhaps almost never, simply one factor that's at play. So, for example, there are intellectual doubts, absolutely. People, have sort of problems with particular doctrines of the Christian faith. Often there's some suffering or some trauma, some bad life experiences in there. Very often, listening to these podcasts, there's hurt caused by the church. People have been treated badly by churches. That's often one factor in this. Sin, we don't want to say that it's all you want to sleep with your boyfriend or whatever, but we would be naive not to factor sin in, given the sort of people that I am and that you are, that somewhere in the mix there's some of that. And also another key factor is a shift in community or a shift in catechesis. Like if you become part of a new friendship group or a new online community, for example, that holds certain values, then it becomes very dissonant not to fall in line with those values. It becomes awkward not to do that. And so there's a pressure on you to change in order to fit in with that community. And all of these factors, I'm sure more as well, could be brought to bear. And it's very rarely one of these things alone that will cause someone to deconstruct their faith. It's usually some sort of combination of these different things. And I think the danger for Christians and for ministries is to act as if it is just one of these things. I've talked already about the simplistic Christian idea that you sometimes hear in these talks, that it's just because people want to be free to sin that they're deconstructing, they want to sleep around or whatever it is. It's too simple. But it's also too simple, I think, to say that it's only the intellectual doubts, and what we need to do is just deal with people's intellectual doubts, and then they'll sort of come back to faith. It's like the whole hand is injured, and just bandaging one of the fingers is not really going to help. It's some use, but it doesn't really deal with the issue. And these are complex human existential questions that have lots of dimensions. And if we just think, we need to deal with intellectual doubts, or we need to deal with the sin, or whatever it is, you're never going to do justice and honor the person as a person, because we're more than that. We're more than intellects. We're more than desires. We're complex people. Anyway, I've gone on, I think, more than long enough. Let me leave you with a few resources. Harry, if we could have the final page. I'm sorry, I don't have a handout version of this, but if you want to take a snap of it or email me later and I can send it through. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's just some things that came to mind as I was preparing this material this evening that I think would be helpful, both for Christians who are seeking to minister to people who are losing their faith and for people who are going through that themselves. So quite a few of the books on the left-hand side are just meaty, honest Christian books that don't treat the faith simplistically and show you the difficulties, but also the wonder of the Bible. So Chesterton's Orthodoxy, for example, is one of those. It's not an easy read, but it's a really refreshing take on the complexities of Christianity that I think is really helpful, and there's a lot of other stuff there. There are some books on the left that are about the phenomenon of deconstruction. They may or may not be helpful if you're either ministering to or going through that yourself. And the Bible passages on the right were just passages that came to mind as I was preparing this material. And you hear someone talking on a podcast and you think, I wish they'd read that passage. I wish I was there to show them that passage. And these were the passages that came to mind there. So those are some reflections for further reading. What I'd love to do now, if we could have the next slide, is stop talking, really. I've spoken enough, and you guys haven't really spoken at all, apart from the few people I had a chat with during dessert. And we've all got perspectives and ideas and experiences to bring to bear on this topic. So I'd love to invite you guys now to reflect. I've got some questions on the screen. You don't have to feel that you need to follow these questions, but I think they can be a helpful route through some of this material. If there's other stuff you want to be talking about, feel free to talk about that instead. Dave, can I invite people to get into little groups? Is that going to work? Brilliant. Feel free to, do the chairs move? Yeah, okay. Feel free to kind of move the chairs. And if you want to get into groups, 5 or 6, but yeah, bigger, smaller, whatever, groups of whatever size you feel comfortable with. And then the questions that I'd invite you to discuss are, if you've come across the trend of deconstructing, do you think it's something new? Or do you think it's just really a term for an age-old issue? Do you think there are any aspects of our own Christian subculture that fit the characterization of the deconstructors? Like that left-hand column, do you think that's us? Do you think that's this church in any sense? Number 3, if you do think there are other cultural norms or assumptions that we add to the gospel, so do you think that there are those things, either knowingly or just without realizing it? If there are, how do you think we can address them? And finally, what sort of things can Christian churches, families and friends do to help and love those who are deconstructing their faith? What do deconstructors need from their churches, friends and families? And there's also a number up on the screen. If you want to text in questions anonymously, we'll do a bit of Q&A at the end as well. Very happy for you to ask questions face-to-face, but if you prefer to ask a question via an anonymous number, then feel free to do it that way too, and we'll deal with as many of those as we can at the end. So let's divide into groups, chew over the material, use these questions if they're helpful, and in about 10 minutes' time, we'll come back and we'll do a bit of Q&A.